On today's episode of the SSPX Podcast, we'll continue our Apologetics Series by looking at creation itself. Father Paul Robinson, the publisher of Angelus Press and prior of St. Isidore's in Denver, Colorado, will look at the theory of evolution. Can a Catholic hold that evolution and creation are both consistent with each other? We'll answer questions like, can non-life turn into life? Can that life then turn into intelligent life? Is there room in the theory of evolution for God? We've already seen that God exists in previous episodes, so how did he bring about life on Earth? And are we able to know for sure? You can find notes to all of these episodes at sspxpodcast.com/apologetics, as well as all our previous episodes. There as well, you can find a link to help support this project. This is free to listen to, as well as all the resources we're posting, but if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, we'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now, let's join Father Robinson for episode number 3 of our Apologetics Series.
Father Robinson, thanks for joining us yet again on our next episode here on Apologetics Series. How is Denver treating you these days? Any snow yet?
Yes, we have quite a bit of snow. We got 3 inches last night, and school had to be delayed by an hour this morning because of the roads. And so winter's upon us. It's nice.
Fantastic.
It's always nice to see the snow at the beginning of the year when the first snow. Always beautiful. But,
absolutely. Yeah. The kids must be excited to have a little bit of delay of school too. So that's fun. Yeah,
it is a nice thing.
Well, today we're talking about one main topic. This is a continuation of what we started talking about last time about how to be an atheist. And one of the ways to be an atheist is definitely to have in your back pocket the theory of evolution, that God is not necessary, that there is no need for a creator. So this is really going to be mainly focused on evolution. Is that right, Father?
That's correct. So if one of the main objections against the existence of God is that nature explains itself, atheists know that that's the most compelling case they can make for God not existing, is basically that he's not needed to cause anything that we see around us. There's no evidence of a higher cause. We look around us and basically the total explanation for what we see is in nature. And of course, Darwin's theory of evolution is one of the main tools that atheists use in order to account for nature's supposed self-explanation. And Richard Dawkins, he famously said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. He wants to say that effectively, when we look out on the natural world, we don't see some sort of purposeful order being placed there, and Darwin's explanation of the natural world seeks to say that effectively all of the diversity of animals and plants that we see just sprang from purely natural forces, and therefore there's no need for a God to create. Now, Darwin himself wasn't necessarily an atheist. All I'm saying is that effectively, atheists often will want to use Darwin's theory in order to support atheism. And I just want to repeat once more, and I'm saying this over and over and over again because it is necessary to repeat this. But that even if Darwin's theory of evolution explains a lot of the diversity of biological form in the world around us, and the Catholic Church has never been opposed to the theory of evolution as such, but even if it explains all of this diversity, we would still need a first cause of existence. We would still need a first cause of the existence of contingent beings. It's clear that the beings around us are contingent, and we would simply say that if Darwin's theory was correct, it would also point to some sort of plan on the part of God, that that God would have just preloaded nature, pre-programmed nature to evolve in a certain direction. He would have embedded in nature the capacity to evolve new life forms from old life forms, more complicated life forms from less complicated life forms. But because of this fact that either way, God's glory is going to be supported, then it's not going to attack the faith as such. And so it's really up to science. We're going to be talking a lot about science today, Andrew, to evaluate this theory of evolution. But if in fact Darwin's theory is true, and a lot of the diversity of biological form is developed over a long period of time through random mutation and natural selection, then atheists would have something more of a case that nature explains itself. We don't need God to explain anything.
Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about science, like you said, Father. I studied art history, so I'm going to put my thinking cap on, and I will try to keep up with you on the science part of things. But I guess we start with just the very basic building blocks of life. So are we going to be taking kind of the position of the atheists on this, or are we going to be taking the position of arguing against the atheists on this episode, Father?
Yeah, so what I want to do is just try to explain what an atheist has to find in reality. If he wants to claim that nature explains itself, what is he going to have to find? When we look out over the natural world, and we as human beings have a rational mind, observe the thing around us, we see three basic ontological levels, three levels of being, of complexity of being. First of all, there's the bridge, the gap between the inanimate world and the animate world, between the non-living and the living, between molecules, chemicals, and so on, and even like bacteria. Then there's the gap between the animals and human beings. Human beings possess something that animals do not, and that is self-consciousness. The rational power, the power to understand concepts, the power to know the idea of self, that I am a separate entity from other things, and so on. So you have non-living, you've got the living non-rational world, and then you've got the living rational world. And if atheists want to make a compelling case that nature explains itself, the best they can do is to say that all these three levels simply develop by natural law, that somehow nature is directed to produce these things. And as I say, I mean, even if they were able to prove that to us, it would still imply a certain order, it still would imply a certain intelligence embedded into nature for it to continually progress in an upward direction. We would still have to say, well, where does this come from? Why is it pre-programmed to develop in that way? But that would be the best case that they could make. So we're just going to try to look at mainly those first two levels. I'm not going to go into the question of how an atheist might explain self-consciousness or free will. And we saw in the previous podcast that logical atheists who are consistent with their own position, they tried to even deny the existence of free will, which is a really, really tough sell, I think, for most everybody. To deny your free will basically shuts down the meaning of any conversation or rational conversation. So the first thing we need to look at is the difference between life and non-life, and to say, is that different? Can that difference between non-life and life, can it be bridged by purely natural forces? The theory of so-called theory of abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is the idea that life can come from non-life. It's almost like spontaneous generation of the Middle Ages, where you have a piece of meat just sitting there, and then all of a sudden flies start to appear, and people conclude, well, flies must come from meat. Well, we are very privileged living in the 21st century because we have so much information about life that we did not have before. So, we can sort of cut the people in the Middle Ages some slack because they didn't have this information. Even the people of Darwin's time in the 19th century, we can cut them some slack as well because they also did not understand the complexity of life nearly to the degree that we do today. And this has to be understood very, very clearly that there is a massive, massive gap in complexity, in order, in functionality between the least of the living things and the highest of the non-living things. So I just want to share with you a quotation about this from a scientist called Michael Denton. His name is Michael Denton. He says, "We now know not only of the existence of a break between the living and the non-living world, but also that it represents the most dramatic and fundamental of all the discontinuities of nature. Between a living cell and the most highly ordered non-biological system, such as a crystal or a snowflake, there is a chasm as vast and absolute as it is possible to conceive." Just an immense distance in order and complexity between the highest of the non-living and the lowest of the living. And in Darwin's time, they just thought of living things and the cell as basically a blob of goo. It's just kind of like Jello. They knew that there was a cell there, but they couldn't see into it as we do today. And they just thought of it as kind of amorphous and it's very, very basic. And so Darwin's theory, strictly speaking, only covers the transition from living things to living things, from the less simpler living things to more complex living things. The people over time, they started to say, well, if Darwin's theory works for the gap between simple life forms and complex life forms, what about the gap between non-living and living? So people also proposed this theory of abiogenesis, and I think we're all familiar with the phrase the primordial soup, that they proposed. And
right.
Sometime in the early history of the Earth, you have some sort of swamp type area in which all these native chemicals are lurking, and it gets struck with lightning, and sort of magically the first cell emerges from a fortuitous sequence of chemical events there in the primordial soup.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, we are very much in a position today to evaluate in a very scientific manner the capacity of nature to produce life from non-life. And the conclusion is that there is absolutely no ability in nature. There's no, with scientists really trying hard to find some possible bridge. Like you say, this sequence of events might produce life from non-life. They haven't even come close.
Okay. So even at this very basic level here, when we're just starting this, like you've been saying, this chasm, this gap between living and non-living, it really can't be done. I mean, even with advances in science, have scientists been able to figure out a way to make even some of the basic building blocks of a cell or proteins or anything like that out of non-living things?
Yeah, scientists, we certainly can't produce life. I mean, we as intelligent agents with all our technology, we certainly can't produce life. But what we have to do is to understand why it's impossible for living things to come from non-living things. We have to look at the basic building blocks of all living things. And this is something that we have to understand up front, is that all living things, from the simplest to the most complex, every single living thing that we know of works on the cell. the cell is the basic building block of life, regardless of what life form that is. And so then we look at the cell and we say, all right, how complex is the cell? Would it be possible for a primordial soup? Would we expect a cell to form in a primordial soup that's fortuitously situated? And let's just talk a little bit about what goes on in the cell. The cell, as we know today, is an immensely complex factory producing molecular machines to sustain life's processes. So the building block of the cell, the main worker in the cell, is the protein. So the simplest of the cells has about 482 different types of proteins. And each protein is built from what are called amino acids. And there's different types of amino acids. There's like what's called a left-handed amino acid and a right-handed amino acid. So the proteins that work in living things, they are only formed from left-handed amino acids. So that's one specification already. And then also there's 20 different types of amino acids. So when you form a protein, what you do is you assemble, you put amino acids, certain different types of amino acids. You concatenate them one next to another. And then these amino acids then go into a molecular machine called a ribosome, and they form the protein, they fold the protein, those amino acids together, and they chemically bond to make the protein. The protein will then be able to go on and perform its specific function in the cell. And so before we can see if we're going to ask if the living can come from the non-living, we have to say, would we expect nature, or do we find nature forming proteins other than in cells? So we know that they're formed in cells. There's tons of proteins being formed all the time as we speak right now. We've got 10 trillion cells in our body, and there's of course the DNA, which is like the database that contains the information, the code that instructs the cell how to form the protein. So the proteins are formed and they go off and they do their business, right? But if you're going to form like a single protein, a lot of times, I mean, like the most basic protein might have 150 amino acids next to one another. And for every single one of them, you've got to have the left-handed amino acid of the specific type, of one of the 20 specific types, in order for the protein, the proper protein to form as it's supposed to be. And so, we ask ourselves the question, do proteins form in the wild? Does nature have a tendency to form proteins? Do amino acids just sort of like to get together in primordial soup type situations and form themselves into proteins? And the answer is no. The answer is no. So people have done this research.
Okay.
In other words, they looked at all the possible combinations of amino acids. There's 20 different types of amino acids. There's left-handed, there's right-handed, and a certain number of those combinations actually form proteins. They look at all the different types of proteins that exist in living things, and they say, okay, how many of the combinations of amino acids actually form proteins? If you understand what I'm saying, there's what's called this combinatorial space. We took 150 slots and we took different types of left-handed amino acids. We just threw them in those slots. We went through all the combinations. We said how many of them would form proteins. It turns out that there's very, very, very few combinations that actually form functional proteins. The number of functional proteins that exist in that whole space of all the different combinations is very, very small. let me just quote myself, something I say in my book. Even if we had tons of amino acids in a puddle and started stirring it and striking it with lightning, the chances of us getting any functional protein would be 1 in 10 to the 164th power. So 1 over 1 and 164 zeros. That's it. Even if we're just assuming even that amino acids would happen to be colliding into one another and wanting to form a string, in the pond.
Okay.
So that number represents the proportion of functional bonded amino acid sequences, the ones that turn into proteins, to total possible amino acid sequences. We have to hit that jackpot 482 times in short order to get some of the raw material for the simplest cell on Earth. We would have to form 482 of those proteins. So 1 in 10 to the 164th power chance of getting the right amino acid sequence, and then that has to happen 482 times just for us to get the raw materials for a cell, much less to coordinate all the raw materials with one another and form DNA. It's just
wow,
pretty much zero. It's mind-bogglingly complex. But in the end, it turns out in the wild, amino acids don't like to hang out anyway. They're not inclined to collide in one another and form proteins. It just doesn't happen. That's
okay.
why we have to eat living things, or I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, but yeah, we living things are the only things that produce protein, I guess is what I want to say.
Okay. So something that's already living has to be able to produce it. It's like you said, the chances of it happening from a random series of events over time, astronomically large, probably beyond astronomically large.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just absolutely no reasonable expectation whatsoever that we can even come close to assembling the raw materials, much less to coordinate those raw materials with one another. But I mean, we're only scratching the surface of the complexity. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about DNA as well. You know that
okay.
In 1953, Francis Crick and James Watson, there in England, they discovered the structure of our genetic code, and that it was a double helix structure, and that this double helix structure it contains the code that our body uses to produce us on a regular basis and regenerate us. As I mentioned, DNA is like the database. It contains all the instructions that make our body what it is. And there's these processes going on all the time in our cell to continually produce, for instance, the protein. One thing that the DNA does is it contains the code necessary to instruct the cell how to produce the proteins necessary to sustain the cell. Those 482 different types of proteins, or however many proteins are in a given cell. So the process of producing a single protein in the cell is just amazing. It's extraordinary. So you have on the spine of the DNA, you have what are called nucleotide bases. We talked about acids, and on the other side there's bases. I think we kind of remember that from our basic chemistry. So the DNA contains bases, and 4 different types of bases that are given letters A, C, G, and T. And what's interesting is that in the production of a protein, what happens in the cell is that the DNA is pulled apart, and there's a certain strand of DNA that is copied onto something called RNA. So the RNA, a new string is produced that contains the nucleotide bases of that section of DNA. So that section contains the instructions for producing a protein. The cell has a process by where it takes apart the DNA double helix, it copies a certain section, it clips the RNA, the copy, and that RNA then goes into a molecular machine where the nucleotide bases are interpreted. And it's what's really absolutely astounding is that it's really a computer code. So there's this messenger RNA that comes and it reads 3 of the nucleotide bases, and based on the sequence of those 3 nucleotide bases, it summons a certain amino acid. So it reads the first part, 1, 2, 3, summons an amino acid, then 4, 5, 6 summons an amino acid, until finally, if there's 150 amino acids, it's got all the amino acids lined up, the right amino acids to form the protein, because it's taken that particular section of code from the DNA. And then once it has that string of amino acids, then those amino acids, that string of amino acids have to go off into, as I explained, the ribosome, which helps the amino acids fold into the right form, because the protein not only has to have those amino acids, it has to be in a certain shape. And if it's not the right shape, it's not going to do its work in the cell. It has to attach itself to certain areas in the cell, and if it's not the right shape, it's not going to be able to attach. So it has to fold into a certain shape, and then there's another molecular machine that does that. And that's just one protein. But what we have to reflect upon is this fact that the DNA contains the equivalent of a computer code that is interpreted by the cells of every single living thing on this planet. That it's not, in other words, it's not a mere chemical reaction, but somehow every cell knows what type of amino acids to summon based on the sequence of the nucleotide bases. And I mean, the only thing that produces code is an intelligent mind. That's the only thing in our repeated experience that's capable of producing computer code. It's not just mere laws of physics going on here.
Right. And someone could say maybe, you could look at like artificial intelligence these days is making all sorts of advances. Artificial intelligence can create code, but you need someone to create the rules for the artificial intelligence to work in the first place. So that doesn't really answer it either. So there's nothing that's just spontaneously generating this type of code and complexity just by itself.
Right. And I mean, if we come upon a laptop in the woods, and we open it up and we push the power button and it just starts doing stuff, we're not going to say, wow, it's amazing what the trees and the rabbits have done. We're obviously going to say, well, this is produced by an intelligent mind. And what I'm saying is that when you unpack the tree and you unpack the rabbit, you find something much more complex even than what you find in the laptop. And so, I mean, if we know a laptop must be programmed by an intelligent mind, then of course it makes all the more sense for a rabbit to be programmed by an intelligent mind, because it's even the DNA is an even more complex code than our computer program.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I'm following you so far. This is outrageously complex, but I'm getting it.
Yes.
I'm with you.
And there's also a mutual dependency between the DNA and the protein. So you've got to have the DNA code in order to produce the protein. And what are the things that work to produce DNA? It's the protein. So in other words, the proteins build DNA, and DNA contains the code to produce the protein. So if you're going to have this happen in nature, it has to happen all at once. It has to be produced all at once. You can't just have proteins floating around, because to produce the first cell, you have to produce the thing that produces the protein, as well as the proteins to produce the DNA at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So
definitely a chicken and egg scenario. They both have to be there. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's basically all that I would like to mention about life coming from non-life. It's just it's not reasonable to think that could ever happen based on what we know life is, the complexity of every single form of life.
Okay. So that's life and non-life. So let's just say, Father, let's give people who hold to evolutionary theory benefit of the doubt, and let's say that over the course of 25 billion years, somehow this all did happen. Everything that you said, somehow there's the 1 in 40 quadrillion chance that it actually did happen. What then? Well, then maybe evolution is real, right? Evolutionary theory, we could say.
Well, as I say, there's no chance. There's no chance. But
okay.
What about if we say, to be honest, some of the atheists, they realize this complexity, this impossibility of explaining life. And so someone like Francis Crick himself, who discovered the DNA molecule, he said, well, maybe something, maybe life was seeded on the planet by aliens. He gave it the fancy name of directed panspermia. Maybe way back in our past, aliens came and seeded the planet with life, and then from there we have all the different life forms develop. So it's just sort of kicking the can down the road, and you would have to ask, well, where did the aliens come from? Where did that life come? You still have to get from non-life to life. Yeah.
Right.
So let's then look at Darwin's theory proper. What Darwin specifically proposed as a way to explain the development of more complex life forms from less complex life forms, and see if his theory it has sufficient explanatory power, that it provides a sufficient and true cause for this diversity of life forms. Richard Dawkins thinks that it does. Richard Dawkins says, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He thinks that it explains everything in the biological world, and that there's no real purpose in the biological world. Stuff just happens fortuitously, and that's why we have dogs and cats and lions and ostriches and things. So what we have to do first, Andrew, is explain what Darwin's theory is, the mechanics of Darwin's theory. So Darwin was very familiar with what humans can do by breeding, that we can breed different species of animals. And we all know how that happens. If you want a dog with floppy ears, you take the dogs with the bigger ears and you start to breed them. And every time you get a dog with bigger ears, you isolate the dog, and you have those dogs breed. And slowly but surely over time, you've got a dachshund. You've got a dog that has the genetic characteristic that you're desiring, and we call that artificial breeding or artificial selection. And Darwin said to himself, if human beings can create such different species of dogs by isolating populations of dogs, maybe nature is able to do that. What if nature is able to somehow isolate animals and then produce different types of animals by the fact that they're isolated? If it could, we would have something called natural selection. It's kind of a metaphor that he used for the process of evolution, because there's no real selection involved. It's not like nature is sitting
Right.
there, like Mother Nature is somehow sitting on a rock in the woods and choosing the animals that are going to be isolated. It's just a metaphor. And the metaphor comes from Darwin's idea that nature selects by a process of survival of the fittest. That when you have a bunch of animals isolated from one another, then the ones who survive with certain genetic characteristics are basically the ones who are the fittest. They're the ones who have survival capabilities, and there's some characteristic in them that enables them to survive. And that's why he speaks of natural selection, that nature selecting them. So I just want to give a quote from my book about how he got his idea for natural selection from the Anglican minister Malthus. I think we've probably heard of Malthusian theory. Malthus was a man who looked at all the resources on the earth, and he says, look, there's a limited number of resources, and there's all these humans competing for the resources. And unless we do something about it, unless we reduce the population, then we're not going to have enough resources for people. And so maybe we should just let the poor die, I think is what he proposed. So here's the quote. Malthus held that human populations grow continually until they hit a certain threshold which matches the available supply of food. At that point, a competition ensues among humans, with some humans acquiring food and surviving, and others failing to get food and perishing. Darwin took Malthus's idea for human populations and applied it to all of nature. There are only a limited number of food resources available to plants and animals on this planet, and food resources cannot be shared. As such, there is constant competition among life forms to sustain and propagate life. In such a competition, the stronger and hardier win out and survive. Those who remain have been quote-unquote selected by nature, and then nature, after randomly arranging life's conditions, has then proceeded to eliminate life forms unable to survive in those conditions while retaining those able to survive. So Darwin is making some assumptions about nature, and that is that nature, that there's this really intense competition in nature for resources among life forms, and that some survive and some die over time, and that those who survive are actually better and superior than those who don't survive. If they survived, it was because they must have some characteristics that makes them superior than the ones who died. And so over time, you get more and more complex life forms evolve.
Okay. It's making sense so far.
Okay.
But, well, I guess we're going to get to that. All right. I'll hold my question.
Okay. Yeah. And this theory was really hailed in its time. There was a lot of enthusiasm for it because there were geologists who were starting to explain natural processes of formations that appear on Earth, that they expected they could make models of how the formations on Earth happened over long periods of time. Also, astronomers were able to hypothesize about the formation of stars and galaxies. And this is all in the inanimate world, by the way, things changing in the inanimate world, which is very basic and very simple compared to life forms. And they said, okay, well, now Darwin is proposing a way for us to explain the biological world by merely natural causes. So he proposed this mechanism, but his theory still had to be tested, and they didn't have much information at that time. So here's how Michael Behe comments on the lack of scientific information at that time. He said, Darwin did not show that apparently purposeful systems could be built by natural selection acting on a random variation. Rather, he just proposed that they might. his theory had yet to be tested at the profound depths of life. In fact, no one then even realized life had such depth. Darwin built the case with the best science available in the 19th century. The case was pretty strong for a few of his theory's multiple aspects, including the descent of modern organisms from earlier ones. It was extremely weak for his proposed mechanism of evolution. A major reason for its weakness was that the science of Darwin's day had no understanding of the molecular foundation of life. Darwin did not understand genetics, he did not understand the cell, he did not understand DNA, and so on. So what we need to do is we need to look at a couple of aspects of Darwin's theory. On the one hand, we need to look at his proposal of what's called common descent, the idea that all of the life forms that we see around us today ultimately derive from simpler life forms in the past. They descend. They're like descendants of the earlier life forms through a long-term process of evolution. And then the other aspect of his theory that we have to look at is the actual capacity of random mutation and natural selection. When we observe life today, in the 21st century, and we look at the changes that are capable of being produced in genetic code, do we see that nature is producing favorable changes and that the fittest are surviving such that we would expect big changes to happen over long periods of time? So the first thing is the question of whether we might see some signs of the animals and plants around us deriving from simpler life forms. And to check this, we have to say that there is a certain evidence for this. There are certain clues that might point to some animals coming from other animals. One of these pieces of evidence is morphology. And that is when we look at the bodies of animals, we can see certain similarities among different animals. So, the biologists, they have a classification of the taxonomical categories. They classify all the animals, and the reason they're able to do that is because of the similarity between them. And one of the classifications is the phylum, which is like a body plan. And there's just 36 different types of body plans in the animal kingdom. In other words, if you take all the animals that there are, there's only 36 different body types. And like we belong to the phylum of mammals, and actually mammal I think is a class, but for all mammals, there's a similarity in our body types, even bats. Both we and bats share, for instance, 7 cervical vertebrae. We have a similar body type to bats, believe it or not. So if we can find these similarities among body types, you might think, oh well, maybe this one animal that has the same body type as another came from that other animal, for instance. Then the fossil record. The fossil record, when we go down into the layers of the earth, which record a certain history of life on Earth, we do see a progression of less complex to more complex. In other words, the highest layers have more complex animals. As you get lower and lower into the layers, you get simpler and simpler and simpler to the point to where there's just sponges around in the Precambrian era, and before that there is just plants. There's no animals. So you only have animals with vertebrae and stuff after a certain period of time towards the top. Right here, just let me read this. The first animals that appear are invertebrates. Then we have vertebrate fish, then reptiles, then birds, then non-placental mammals, then placental mammals, and then humans. This is the progression in the fossil record. And if we see this progression from simpler to complex, you might think, well, maybe the more complex came from the less complex. Maybe the top layers derived from the bottom layers. maybe. Then the third piece of evidence that they give, evolutionists would give, for what's called common descent, is DNA analysis. They compare the DNA of plants and animals to one another, and what they find is that plants that we would expect to be related to one another have more DNA in common, and in animals we expect to be more related to one another have more DNA in common, whereas the things that are further apart that we expect to be very different, like the difference between an elephant and a daffodil, their DNA is going to be quite different from one another.
Right.
So if there's a greater similarity of the DNA of mammals, then we might think, well, maybe one animal is produced from another just by the modification of its DNA. Yeah.
Okay. So it seems to be that there's might be some compelling, at least logic behind this, this common ancestry so far, at least.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Let me just give you a quotation about the similarity of DNA.
Okay.
Proteins that did the same job were similar yet different between species, but became more different as the biological distance between the species increased. For example, a small protein called cytochrome C, which helps produce energy in the cell, was determined to be identical in humans and chimpanzees in all 104 of its amino acid positions. Between humans and dogs, there were 11 differences. Between us and tuna, 21 differences. Between people and moths, almost a third of the total positions differed. Between humans and yeast, almost a half of the positions differed. So what they do is they make the comparison, and they look at the proteins that run in our cells. And they say, what are the amino acids that make up our protein? And how are they different? And they're comparing us with chimpanzees, us with dogs, us with tuna, and us with yeast and moths. And so as you get further away to our body type, there's greater differences in our genetic code. Okay, so that's certain evidences in this similarity. Is this sufficient to prove Darwinian evolution to be true? Well, no, it's not. It's not at all conclusive, because of the fact that a similarity between animal forms, it might mean that they derive from one another by a natural process. It might also mean that there was some intelligent being who was just using a common design. So, if I see a Camaro on the road, and I see a Ford Taurus, and I look and I'm like, okay, they've got similar parts to one another, and the mechanics are basically the same. Does that mean that over a long period of time, the Ford Taurus produced the Camaro? Well, not necessarily. I mean, it could have happened. Right. It could have happened by merely natural processes, if nature has that power. But it could also have been that you have a designer who has an idea, that there's a similar idea, that idea is refined over time and made more perfect, or there's just variations on that one idea, that the designer has a variation that he wants to implement, various different types of cars he wants to produce, one more directed to efficiency, the other more directed to speed, for instance. So, I mean, this is the way it is with technology. A computer looks very different from a cell phone, but the cell phone is ultimately a derivative of the computer, right? It's technology that's down the road from the computer.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that's also a possibility when we see the similarity among animals. That it could mean that an intelligent designer decided that he wanted to make a lot of variations on one theme. Even musical composers like to do this. We know that intelligent minds like to do this. So it's not conclusive.
Okay. Right. It's not at all. I guess then we would need to look at this random mutation and natural selection is kind of the next step here. And we've all seen, the chapter in our biology textbook that looks at the moths on the tree, the soot-covered tree, and the moths that were darker survived because they blended in, and so the ones that were lighter, they died out because they were eaten by the birds. That's natural selection. That happens. That's true. But could that explain all the rest of the natural selection that is proposed as the theory of life?
Right. So, if we see all this similarity among the animals, for instance, we have to ask ourselves, is that similarity produced by random mutation and natural selection, the cause that Darwin proposes? And, Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and he observed the finches there. The Galapagos Islands are many different islands, and there were different species of finches. And there was some islands that went through a drought, and the finches are eating seeds, and some finches were not able to break into the seeds because they were harder. So some of the seeds were harder than others. And it was only the finches with the bigger beaks that were able to break through the hard seeds. And when there was a drought and there was not a lot of seeds being produced, the finches with the smaller beaks were dying out, and the bigger finches were living, and eventually just had only finches with big beaks, And so this is, for Darwin, this was like certain evidence that maybe nature can pull this off. So we're just going to look at various things that have to happen, that have to be true of nature for random mutation and natural selection to be able to produce all the diversity of biological form that we see around us. One of the things that we would expect to test this theory, and this is how science works, by the way. Darwin proposes an hypothesis that a process of random mutation and natural selection is able to diversify biological form. And if his theory is true, it's going to predict certain things. It's going to predict that we're going to find certain things in nature, right? And then the scientists go out and say, we need to test this hypothesis. Let's go out and see if nature actually is the way that this theory predicts. So one of the predictions is that there has to be a great continuity between various life forms. What I mean is like if you look at all the living things, you think of that iconic diagram of like the hunched over ape, and then he's slowly standing up, and then you got a man. I mean, that's sort of what you would expect to find throughout all of nature, that basically there's a continuum amongst all living things. If you start with a protozoa or a bacterium, you can make a little connection between the next most complex thing, the next one, next one, all the way till you get to man. Basically there's differences between them. Those different sections is very small. The famous missing links. That's one thing that we would expect to find. And we would also expect to find that it's very easy to change living things. That it's very easy to introduce changes such that they start to develop new functions. You think of the fish, sprouting a leg and then crawling up onto the sand, in order to obtain some sort of survival advantage, or sprouting a wing and starting to flap around and fly. We would expect that the genetic code of a fish would easily allow for it to sprout wings or take on new functions over time by the modification of its genetic code. Well, what is it that we actually discover when we look at the components of living things? And I'm talking about all living things. What we find is that life forms are not at all happy to being pushed around. they are very, very set in what they are. And there are very strict boundaries for what living things are. They're not the sort of gooey, amorphous stuff that you can easily mess with, kind of like Play-Doh, and shape into whatever you want. But rather, there are very strict boundaries that exist between different types of things. And between those boundaries, there is an immense gap that cannot be bridged by genetic modifications, that these life forms do not allow themselves to be changed into other things. So we have, since the time of Darwin, we have been able to investigate living things to an immense detail, unimaginable in Darwin's time. So if what he was saying was true, we would expect for us to be able to nudge a life form, and it would easily transition to being another type of life form. What we find instead is that you push a life form, you push it, and it either dies or it mutates into something that's bizarre and not functional. So I just want to look at some of the evidence that has come forth that shows that this is not the way nature works. The way Darwin is portraying nature is not actually the way nature works, the biological world works. So as far as the fixation in species that I was talking about, there have been a lot of breeding that has been done, just at the level of breeding, instead of like tinkering with the DNA. What about breeding? How far can you go with breeding? I want to quote from a book called The New Biology. It says the following: between 1800 and 1878, crossbreeding increased the sugar content of sugar beets from 6% to 17%. But 50 years of subsequent experiments produced no further increases. All experienced breeders recognize the constraints. Luther Burbank says, "I know from my experience that I can develop a plum half an inch long or one 2.5 inches long with every possible length in between, but I am willing to admit that it is hopeless to try to get a plum the size of a small pea or one as big as a grapefruit." So you keep trying to breed, push in the direction, but there's a hard limit on either side that's placed there by nature itself. And this plum is not willing to change into anything. You reach a barrier and you can't get across it. So if Darwin's theory were true, there would be no barriers. Everything would be fluid. You could keep pushing, and it would change into another thing. It would change into many different things. But that's just not the way it is.
Right.
So
there are upper limits in the code or in the DNA or whatever of the living thing, whether it's a plum or a human or an ape or a bat. There's limits there, and for that to jump from one species or kind to another is next to impossible statistically.
It's completely impossible. It's not possible. I mean, this guy is saying, he says it's hopeless. It can't happen. Okay. We've tried everything. And that's at the level of breeding. So you're just isolating different types of plums, the bigger plums, the plants producing bigger plums, okay, to get the bigger ones, or the plants producing smaller plums. So they've tried that at the level of breeding. But scientists have also done it at the level of DNA, and they've done something called saturation mutagenesis. So it's a method of experimentation where you get into the genetic code and you modify the genetics in all possible ways. This is what was done with the famous fruit fly experiment, where you try to genetically modify fruit flies in every way possible and see what you get. Are we going to get fruit flies turning into a different species of fly? Are we going to get the housefly? Can we produce a housefly from a fruit fly?
Right.
Yeah. So here's what I say in my book about this. Two German geneticists, starting in 1979, executed saturation mutagenesis experiments on fruit flies. What this means is they isolated the small subset of genes that specifically regulate embryonic development and mutated one or more of those genes in different fruit fly embryos until eventually they had mutated all of them. Most of the mutants perished as deformed larvae long before achieving reproductive age. Others survived and had major changes, but all such changes were deleterious. Some fruit flies had no eyes, others had legs growing out of their heads, and still others had wings deformed in such a way that they could not fly. None of them turned into a new species with greater functionality. But as Meyer points out, we should not expect new and better animals to develop from introducing random mutations into the embryonic development. The reason is that the egg to embryo process is delicate and complex, that with every part needing to be in its proper place at the right time, performing its assigned function, for the result to be correct. If you introduce changes at one stage and do not compensate for that change at other stages, then you will ruin the entire process. The only way to make a beneficial change would be to accompany that change with corresponding changes at every stage. Evolution cannot do this, though, since it works by gradual changes, which is the same as saying that it works by single changes. This situation leads to the great Darwinian paradox. Animals do not tolerate mutations at the beginning of their development, but that is the only time that they can be changed substantially. They do tolerate mutations after they have developed, but such mutations can only induce minor changes. The empirical evidence then seems to clearly indicate that large-scale macroevolution is impossible. And I don't know if all that makes sense, and I think I send you a link to a video about how to build a worm that gives an illustration of this. And that is this: if you want major changes, major evolutionary changes, then what you need to do is change the genetics at the very beginning of the development of an embryo. But what the scientists have found is when you do that with the fruit flies, you start tinkering with the genetics in the larva stage, in the egg stage, then you get freaks. You don't get like these wonderful permutations, but there's like a continuum where you keep pushing into one side, pushing, then you just get dead fruit flies. You get freaky fruit flies. That's a tongue twister. You get freaky fruit flies on one side, and so finally they're just all dead. They don't survive. And then you go to the other direction, right. You get more freaky fruit flies, and then they're dead. But you don't right. get some new species.
Yeah, interesting. So in this case, it may be possible that there are gene mutations and defects, and we see this all the time. But those defects usually mean that, like you said, the animal dies or is such that natural selection then would wipe it out because it wouldn't have any ability to eat or reproduce or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is contrary to what we would expect if Darwin's theory is true. So another thing that I want to point out along these lines is that from Darwin's perspective, if life is just all a continuum, then the history of life would work like this. You would start with the simplest of life forms that would be very, very similar. And slowly but surely over time, the fossil record is what you would find is a branching out and a greater diversification from the lowest of the taxonomical categories. You would start at the beginning with just one species of life and slowly branch out to another species, Then finally you can have a genus, and then over time you get multiple genera, and then you would have families, then you would have classes, orders, phyla, kingdoms, all the different taxonomical categories would slowly but surely appear over time. That's what you would expect to find in the fossil record, going from the lowest taxonomical category where everything's almost basically the same, to greater branching out and diversification over time. Very gradually, very continuously, very smoothly. This is what we would expect to find. But now that we know what's in the fossil record, after Darwin, and he kind of knew something about this, is not that at all. I did mention that you get less complex to more complex, but we do not find that the species slowly branching into genera, slowly branching into families, slowly branching into classes. But what we find rather is explosion in the taxonomical categories, especially what's called the Cambrian explosion, and there's also something of a plant explosion. So in other words, in the pre-Cambrian era, in the fossil record, you just have sponges, very, very basic life forms, and you would expect to find slowly branching out into more complex life forms. Not what you find. What you find is all of a sudden in the Cambrian period, which is like a pulse in the fossil record, it's just a narrow window of the fossil record. What you find is all of a sudden out of nowhere appear all these different types of animal phyla. Basically, all the different body plans, except for one that we know today, appeared in a very narrow window of biological time called the Cambrian period. And that's why it's referred to as the Cambrian explosion. So instead of us getting species turning into genera and turning into families, orders, classes, and so on, you have some sponges, and then all of a sudden, boom, you jump up to all of these different phyla, all of these different body plans appearing out of nowhere. So that is not a bottom-up progression in the fossil record as predicted by Darwin. It's a top-down. So what you do is you start off with great diversification in the fossil record. And then within those great differences, then you have other animals develop, those lower taxonomical categories. So that's just the opposite of what Darwin predicted. And that alone kind of falsifies his theory.
Very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. That was that seems to at least imply some sort of intervention in some sort of creation.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I'm trying to be as fair as possible to people who believe in evolution here, but there's something that happened there. It has to be.
Yeah. You have just tons of different designs of animals appearing. And it's clear that nature is not producing them. Or we have no reasonable expectation for nature to produce them. It contradicts the predictions of Darwin. So another thing we have to look at is this assumption that Darwin took, or he got an idea from Malthus about, and that is the ruthless competition that he expected to find in nature. What the engine that drives evolution in his mind is the competition for resources. Like what I explained about the finches. They don't have sufficient beaks to get to the harder seeds and nourish themselves. And it's the bigger birds who get with the harder beaks who get the resources. So Darwin saw nature as red in tooth and claw, as the expression goes. I think that might be a poem from Tennyson, I can't remember. And that animals, basically what you have in the natural world is multiple species of plants and animals all going for the same thing, all going for the same resource. And as a result, only some of them are able to get the resource and the others die out. And the ones who get it, they have a survival advantage, therefore they're superior, and they evolve. They're part of the process of evolution. So what has happened since the time of Darwin is we've analyzed the state of nature, and we're able to say whether or not animals are in a great state of competition or not. And this is for me is something very interesting, Andrew, because it ties into our discussion last time about the order that God has placed in the universe. If there is a God, we would expect there would be a great harmony amongst the animals and the plants. That they would somehow have a symbiotic relationship. They would work together. They would get along. They would occupy space in a very harmonious way. It wouldn't be a dog eat dog world. I don't know if that's the best expression, but
You're right.
It wouldn't be like that in nature. So what we find is that nature, in fact, employs many strategies to prevent competition. And I took this from this book, The New Biology, that I quoted earlier. The authors, they point out that nature often isolates geographically species that could eliminate one another, that life forms that do live in the same habitat, they occupy different ecological niches. So they have different diets, they have different periods of activity, they introduce different changes in the environment. So here's a quote: "Among the most thoroughly documented principles in the science of ecology is the dictum that two species never occupy the same niche." So they're going after different things. They're not in competition. They're harmoniously occupying the same space. There's mutual sharing of resources, space, light, water, and food, so that as many as possible can survive, rather than the pursuit of mutual elimination. We don't see plants and animals seeking to eliminate one another. We see periodic migration of birds, fish, mammals, and insects to avoid competition. You see the sequential flowering of plants to avoid competition in attracting pollinators. Even predators are kind to their prey by never eliminating its species and also maintaining with it a dynamic equilibrium. You sent on to me after our last podcast that video about the wolves in Yellowstone Park, and how when the deer did not have their predator there, then things kind of fell apart in the resources of Yellowstone Park. It turned out that having the wolves there restored the balance and that harmonious equilibrium. And the wolves are not going to eliminate the deer, but they're going to make it possible for the vegetation, the plants, to flourish, and also for the deer to flourish at the same time. So that was just an example of this principle. Then also symbiotic relationships between animals such that two species have a mutual interdependence. This interdependence is even found between the whole of the plant kingdom, which produces oxygen needed by animals, and that of the animal kingdom, which produces carbon dioxide needed by plants. And this is why ecologists are so worried about the elimination of species, like the endangered species. They know that if you take one animal or one plant out of an area, then it might disrupt the harmony that exists. They just assume there's a great harmony here. They know there's going to be a great harmony. It's not competition that's red in tooth and claw, but there's this symbiotic relationship. If you remove one piece out of it, things could fall apart, and animal plant life could really suffer.
Right. Or on the flip side, you bring in an invasive species like, Asian carp into the Mississippi River, and all of a sudden that explodes and it takes over the whole thing, and that's chaos.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. That whole point about the geographical isolation of some species, that if they were put together, they wouldn't be harmonious. If you just leave things where they are, it works out well.
Right.
Okay.
It's almost like there's a plan there or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Looking a little bit fishy. No pun intended. So one more assumption we have to look at, Andrew, and this is the last one. I know this is a long podcast, but
it's good.
This is like one of my favorite topics and something I've just read a lot about. So I find it really fascinating.
It is.
And so this last assumption concerns the mutations that take place in genetic code. As I mentioned before, Darwin didn't understand genetic code. And so people who came after Darwin and learned about genes, they kind of modified his theory and just simply specified what random mutation meant. They modified what is meant by random mutation. They say it means the modification of genetic material. And we know that in the transcription of DNA, when DNA is copied, that over time, sometimes the copying doesn't take place perfectly. And the neo-Darwinists, they speculate that the mutations that take place, the bad copying that sometimes takes place, is very rare, but it does happen. You get these natural mutations in DNA that they create new function, that you can modify DNA, and over time you're going to get new function in plants and animals. So in order to test this, we have to investigate certain concrete cases of evolution where we actually know genetic code has been changed, and see if those genetic code, is the modification of genetic code actually provides a survival advantage. And we've been able to, or the scientists have been able to do a lot of research in this area. They've dug into the genetics of animals, and especially in the cases where they've speculated that they might have a survival advantage. What have they found? What have their investigations revealed? They have revealed that sometimes random mutations do create a survival advantage that give an animal the capacity to survive when the animal that doesn't have the mutation does not survive. But at the same time, when you have that situation, the animal that survives gains its survival advantage through a breaking of its genetic code. In other words, the animal that survived had less function in its genetics than the animal that died. That's why sometimes people have referred to evolution as not a theory of the survival of the fittest, but the arrival of the fittest. It's just a way of saying that those who survive are not really the fittest, or that what you mean by the fittest is simply those survive. It's not really those who have better genetics. So let me quote Michael Behe again. He says, "The amazing but in retrospect unsurprising fact established by the diligent work of many investigators in laboratory evolution over decades is that the great majority of even beneficial, positively selected mutations damage an organism's genetic information, either degrading or outright destroying functional coded elements." So sometimes, an animal's genetics can be modified and some function is destroyed, but it gives them a survival advantage. He gives the example of polar bears. So polar bears had a genetic modification that gave them a white coat, which, it's not a breaking of genes. Well, I guess it's breaking of the color gene. But they also had a breaking of genes that allowed them to be fatter, to have a fatter mass. And this gave them a survival advantage in the Arctic to be able to survive in colder weather, So
right.
Dr. Behe, he takes the example of sometimes, in the old days when you have the ships and they're being batted about, and in order to survive, they have to throw off the cargo. And when they throw off the cargo, it lightens the ship and they're able to get through the storm. This is kind of what's happening. Sometimes throwing off some of the genetic code and breaking function gives animals a survival advantage. He says, degrading machinery can be useful for some purposes, perhaps because its function is unneeded at the time, and so the scrapped machine doesn't waste energy, or because in changed circumstances, the product the machine made is now detrimental, or some other reason. But natural selection can't build a coherent new system. So we see in nature examples of genes being broken and in providing a survival advantage. But what we know that random mutation natural selection can't do is it can't rebuild the function. We have no examples whatsoever of random mutation actually building some sort of function in an animal. And this is just simply what we would expect if the genetic code is perfect for that animal. So if you have a machine that's absolutely perfect, and it's perfectly designed, then you know if you take anything away from it, you're going to take away from its perfection. In other words, it's at the apex of its fineness, and there's
right.
no wiggle room for making it better for what it is. And what we're discovering is
right.
that the bears are best for what it means to be a bear, or dogs are best for what it means to be a dog. And if you're going to change your genetic code, there's only one way to go, and that is down. You're going to modify them, and in modifying them, you're going to make them worse necessarily than they are for what they're made to be. This is what you would expect if they were actually designed to be what they are,
Right. That's why you have on some very specific dog breeds, there's a lot of other health problems. Maybe a hunting dog is very, very keen eyesight or something and is very docile, but it has really bad hips. I don't know. I'm making this all up, but there's lots of cases like that.
Yeah, I mean, the dachshund is just like a hot dog, and they can hardly walk. They're
right.
genetically modified, or they're bred to have that shape and the floppy ears. But I wouldn't put one out in the wild. I don't think they would do very well.
No.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So let me just give this quote about the polar bear. The polar bear is a variety of brown bear that, quote unquote, evolved to survive in Arctic cold. In fact, it can hybridize with Alaskan brown bear. How did it do that? B shows that genes for regulating fat and for metabolizing cholesterol became broken or blunted. And this had a side effect of keeping the bears warm in cold climates, changing their coat color while permitting them to survive on fatty diets of seal. Darwin's mechanism did not create anything new. It broke things, but in the case of the polar bear, it worked out. So that's all that we're able to observe, is that the random mutation is capable of producing new function. Is not capable of producing new function, but it is capable of breaking, and sometimes that provides a survival advantage. And this is why, the evolutionists are never able to provide any real evidence of macroevolution. They're not able to show any concrete examples of new function coming by somehow genetic code being modified in such a way that you have more complexity in the area of functionality. And this is not surprising, Andrew. I mean, once we know that all living things work on DNA, and that DNA is computer code, we should not expect that single changes that takes place over discrete periods of time are going to be able to produce new function. What you have to do is you have to write new code. I used to be in the computer programming, and what you learn in computer programming is that unless all of the instructions are perfectly lined up, then your program's not going to run properly. Just one little mistake and your program's messed up. And if you want to add new function, you're going to have to write a new subroutine. You have to write a whole body of new code. You can't just change a few characters here and there slowly over time and expect to get new function.
Right.
You need an intelligent mind to introduce that new function.
Right. The transition period is a broken period, and then it'll just stop working.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
As you're designing that code, if you just wanted to step in and say, let's run this code, it's not going to run. It's not going to run.
It won't run.
So,
yeah.
So
or it'll run badly.
Yeah. Yeah. Depending on the importance of the subroutine that you're writing.
Right.
So,
well, that's fascinating, Father.
yeah. So at the end of the day, if we really give Darwin's theory a nice run and treat it fairly and look at all the evidence and so on, we have to conclude that random mutation and natural selection are not capable of doing what he hoped they would be capable of doing. And we are blessed today to have all this information about the biological world. And, Michael Behe, for instance, he tries to find what he calls the edge of evolution and say, how much can evolution do? Can it produce new species, new genera? We know that animal breeders can produce new species of dogs, for instance. How far can evolution go? He concludes, I think, that the most maybe new families. I think he might have revised that over time now that we have more information about the DNA, maybe new genera, and that's as far as it can get. It can't go up to the higher taxonomical categories.
Wow. And all that said, Father, we haven't even talked about how in the mind of an evolutionist that the human consciousness exists.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other can of worms that we're not even going to go down, but we're just looking at it purely on the natural level. Yeah.
I mean, how do you go from an ape to an intelligent human being? I was once, I put the story in my book, but I was once on a ferry boat going between two islands in the Philippines, and they had on there the movie playing The Return of the Planet of the Apes. And what happened is they got this lab where they got these apes. I don't know if you've seen this movie. I don't think I even finished watching it, but because the boat landed. But they're messing with chemicals, and it turns out that this one ape develops intelligence just by receiving this chemical, and then one of the workers takes it home and starts to educate it and stuff. And the implication is that the difference between animals and men is just the chemicals that are in our brain. So it's just reducing us to merely material things. But the fact is that intelligence is a spiritual faculty, consciousness is a spiritual thing, and that's almost an even bigger gap to bridge in between non-life and life, between the material and the spiritual, and that cannot be accounted for by merely material processes. So I mean, basically, from my perspective, Andrew, is just getting back to the question of what evolution is capable of, because I know you were asking me about this before we started this podcast, about is it possible that God infused a human soul into a highly evolved ape? What I'm saying is the scientific evidence shows that evolution the Darwinian mechanism is not capable of producing a highly evolved ape, a humanoid form, of making that bridge, that between us and the ape, there is a genetic void. That even if our DNA is very similar, you're going to have to reprogram the DNA in order to get a human-like form. And to reprogram DNA, you need an intelligent mind. It's the only way to do it. It's not like our DNA is just next to it, and it's like, it's 98% similar. Fine, 98% similar. But to get the 2% difference, you have to reprogram the DNA. There's no way.
It's still a really big gap. Yeah, absolutely.
It's an immense gap that can only be bridged by a purposeful, intelligent mind.
Right. Father, this has been fascinating. And yeah, like you said, we did go over our time that we normally do, but this was worth it. And I can tell that you're fascinated by this topic because there's just a wealth of information there. So thank you. Thank you for getting this all prepared for us. That was wonderful.
Yeah. Nature, there's certain things that it does on its own, and there's certain things that it does not. And one thing it does not do on its own is produce the great variety of biological diversity that we see before us. And we have to say the only adequate cause for that is someone really, really smart and really, really powerful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Father, thank you so much. Looking forward to the next time.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Apologetics Series on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on this podcast. This will help to make sure more people can find this podcast and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.